The village his grandparents called home sat just under 2 hours from the city by car, a small cluster of houses pressed close together at the edge of open farmland, the kind of place where the roads narrowed gradually as you approached, as though the land itself was asking you to slow down. Kenji had been making the trip since he was old enough to remember summers, winter breaks, the occasional long weekend when his parents decided he needed fresh air and his grandparents needed company. He loved it there. His grandfather, Taro, was a man of few words but great patience, the kind of old man who could sit with a fishing line in the water for 3 hours without moving, content simply to be present at the edge of a thing. His grandmother, Fumiko, filled every room she occupied with the smell of cooking and the sound of mild, ongoing commentary about the weather, the neighbors, the price of vegetables. Between the two of them, they had turned a modest farmhouse into the kind of place that felt genuinely safe, the kind of place where nothing bad could reach you. Kenji was 17 the last time he made the trip. It was spring break, the weather unusually generous for the season, and rather than asking for a ride, he had decided to cycle the full distance. He left before dawn and arrived by mid-morning, pleasantly tired, his cheeks flushed from the cool air. He had been stretching out at the side of the road, enjoying a warm patch of sunlight when he heard it. Not a mechanical sound, not wind through wire, not an engine, not anything he had a ready category for. A sound that was human in the way that a sound can be human without quite being speech. A sound that lived in the register of voice but carried no meaning, only rhythm. Po, 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 po. He sat up and looked toward the hedge that ran along the opposite side of the road. It was a tall hedge, well above head height, 2 meters at least, probably more. And above its topmost edge, moving slowly from left to right, was a white hat. That was the first strange thing. The second strange thing was that the hat moved at exactly the height a person's head would be if that person were significantly taller than any person Kenji had ever seen. Not a little taller, the kind of taller that doesn't make sense. The hat reached a gap in the hedge, and for a moment the whole figure was visible. A woman in a white dress, moving along the far side as if she had not noticed him. She was facing away. He could not see her face. Then she was gone. The sound stopped. The road was empty. Kenji stood there for a moment, turning this over in his mind, and arrived at the most rational explanation available. Tall platform shoes, maybe, or a man dressed in women's clothing. Odd, but not frightening. He filed it under strange and got back on his bicycle. Fumiko had made rice crackers and green tea, and the 3 of them sat in the sunlit kitchen the way they always did. Kenji told them about the bike ride, the route he'd taken, the shortcut that had turned out not to be a shortcut. And then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned the strange woman. He described the white dress, the hat above the hedge, the odd sound. He started to say something about platform shoes, but before he could reach the end of his theory, he watched his grandfather's face change. The change was not gradual. It was immediate and total, the way a light goes out rather than fades. Taro set his cup down with great deliberateness. "When did you see this?" His voice was careful and flat. "On the road, maybe half a kilometer back." "How much taller than the fence?" "I don't know, maybe a head's worth, more." "Did it look at you?" She was facing away. But Taro was already standing, already moving toward the hallway. He slid the door shut behind him. On the other side of the closed door, Fumiko sat very still with her hands in her lap and a small, effortful smile arranged on her face. She was trembling. Not dramatically, just a fine tremor in her hands, the kind that comes from the body knowing something the face is trying to deny. From the hallway came the murmur of Taro's voice on the telephone, low and urgent, the words indistinct. The kitchen felt very quiet. Taro returned with his expression settled into something harder than worry, something that looked more like resolve. He told Kenji he was staying the night. Then he said he was going to collect someone named Masa-san, and he left again. Fumiko spoke carefully and in pieces, the way you speak about something that must be said but should not be said carelessly. She told him the name first, Hachishaku-sama. She explained the measurement, the old Japanese unit, roughly the length of a forearm, stacked 8 times, nearly 2.5 meters, nearly 8 feet tall. She told him that Hachishaku-sama was not a person. She was something older than the village, something that had been in this area longer than the farmhouses and the roads and the hedgerows, something that no one fully understood, but that everyone in the village had grown up knowing they must not draw attention from. Her appearance was not fixed. Sometimes she looked young, sometimes old. What never changed was the height and the sound. Po, po, po. When she becomes interested in someone, Fumiko said quietly, she does not stop. Once she has truly noticed you, she will follow until she has what she wants. Kenji asked what she wanted. Fumiko looked at her hands. She takes people, children mostly, young people. The last one was 15 years ago. And she's trapped? You said she was trapped. In the shrine, yes, sealed with 4 Jizo statues, north, south, east, west. The neighboring villages have an agreement to maintain it in exchange for certain rights. It has held for many years. She paused. It seems it may not be holding as well as it was. Master-san arrived in the early evening. She was very old, the kind of old that has moved past fragility back into something structural, like weathered wood. She pressed a small paper charm into Kenji's hand without ceremony and went upstairs with Taro. Kenji held the charm and tried to identify what he felt. He concluded it was the very specific fear of realizing that the adults around you, the adults who have always been the ceiling of the world, are genuinely frightened. His grandmother would not let him use the bathroom alone. She stood in the doorway watching him with apologetic eyes. This, more than anything, made it real. The room they put him in was small and clean. The window had been covered with newspaper, and affixed to the newspaper was a charm identical to the one he carried. In each corner sat a small pile of salt, Mauricio, sacred salt, used in purification rites. On a low wooden box near the bed was a small Buddha statue. The bucket in the corner required no explanation. Taro stood in the doorway and held Kenji's eyes for a long moment. 7 in the morning, he said. Not before. Whatever you hear, whatever you think you hear, you do not open this door before 7. He did not say whatever voice you hear. He said whatever you think you hear. Kenji would remember the distinction later. Masa-san told him to hold the charm and to pray if he became frightened. Then they left him. He watched television for a while without absorbing any of it. He wasn't hungry. Eventually, with the TV still running at low volume, he fell asleep. He woke to a late-night program and the particular quality of darkness that belongs to one in the morning. His watch confirmed the time, and then from the window he heard the tapping. It was light at first, patient. The sound of something that was in no hurry because it had no reason to be in a hurry. Kenji pulled the blanket tighter and turned up the TV. He made himself tea from the thermos his grandmother had left. He looked at the newspaper-covered window and told himself it was a branch. The tapping continued, measured and persistent, the way only something intentional can be persistent. Then he heard his grandfather's voice from the hallway. "Are you all right in there? It's okay to come out if you're too scared." Kenji was halfway to the door before he stopped himself. He stood in the center of the room and made himself think. Taro's exact words, "Whatever you think you hear, you do not open this door before 7. He had not said, "I won't be speaking to you." He had said, "I won't be." Kenji had not fully absorbed the implication until this moment. "It's okay," the voice said again. "Come here." It was close to his grandfather's voice. It was almost his grandfather's voice. But there was something underneath it, or rather, something absent from it. Some quality of warmth that Kenji could not name, but recognized only in its absence. The way you recognize a familiar song played in the wrong key. The goosebumps arrived all at once, a full body wave from scalp to feet. He looked at the corner nearest the window. The salt was darker than it had been. He crossed the room, lowered himself to the floor in front of the Buddha, pressed the charm between both palms, and began to pray. He was not, in his ordinary life, a particularly religious person. He prayed now with the absolute sincerity of someone who has run out of other options. Popopo, po, popo. The tapping became knocking. The knocking became something harder, a flat, open-handed slap against the glass from the outside of a second-floor window. The newspaper shuddered. Kenji pressed his forehead to his clasped hands and kept praying. He does not remember much of what followed in terms of sequence or time. He remembers the sound of the morning news. He remembers looking up at the TV clock and seeing 7:13. The tapping had stopped. The voice was gone. The salt in the corners had gone almost entirely black. He opened the door. His grandmother and Masa-san were both in the hallway. Fumiko was crying, the steady, quiet tears of someone who has been holding themselves together all night and can now afford to let go. She told him everything was going to be okay. Downstairs, Kenji's father, Hiroshi, was waiting. He had driven through the night from the city. He hugged his son with a force that communicated everything he wasn't saying. Outside, gathered near a van in the road, were men. 8 of them, plus a driver. All of them were blood relatives, cousins, great-uncles, distant relations Kenji barely knew by name. Taro and Masa-san had spent the night making calls. They put Kenji in the center of the van. 1 man on each side, 3 in front, 3 behind. Masa-san took the front passenger seat. He was told to keep his eyes down and his face toward the floor. "You are the only one who can see her," Taro said through the window. "Don't give her that. Keep your eyes down." The convoy moved out slowly. Taro's car in front, the van in the middle, Hiroshi's car behind. They drove through the village and onto the open road, and for a while there was nothing except the sound of engines and Kenji's own breathing. Then Masa-san's voice came from the front seat, low and warning. "It's coming." She began to chant, Buddhist phrases that rolled together into a continuous, focused sound, and beneath it, through the glass and the engine noise and the chanting, "Pop-pop-pop-pop-pop." Kenji's head came up before he could stop himself. Through the window beside him he saw the white dress, not rushing to catch the vehicle, not falling behind, keeping pace, stationary relative to the moving car, the way something enormous can sometimes appear to stand still while everything around it moves. The figure began to lower its head toward the window. The man beside him said sharply, "Eyes down." Kenji shut them. What followed, the tapping, simultaneous on every window of the van at once, was heard by everyone. All 9 men heard it begin, heard it continue, and then heard it slowly, unevenly fade, like rain passing. Masa-san stopped chanting. The cars pulled over. Taro explained the logic afterward. Surround the target with as many people of the same bloodline as possible, hoping to dilute the signal, to confuse the tracking. It was not a certain strategy. It was the best available strategy. Masa-san asked Kenji for the charm. He had forgotten he was still holding it. He opened his hand. It had been pale paper when she gave it to him the evening before. It was now almost entirely black. She looked at it for a long moment without expression. Then she produced a new charm and handed it to him. "Just in case," she said, and left it at that. Kenji drove home with his father. Hiroshi did not speak for a long time. Then, somewhere on the highway, without taking his eyes off the road, he said that a friend of his, a boy he had grown up with in that same village, had been taken by Hachishaku-sama when they were both young. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. In the years that followed, Kenji found it easier not to think about any of it. The mind has a strong preference for coherence, and the events of that spring break did not fit comfortably into a coherent account of the world. He told himself it had been suggestion and fear. He told himself the salt had darkened from humidity. He told himself the voice at the door had been a dream. What he could not explain away was the charm. He had held it for less than 24 hours, slept holding it, prayed holding it, crossed open road with it pressed to his chest. He had seen what color it was when Masa-san gave it to him. He called Taro from time to time over the years, and once asked, carefully approaching the topic sideways, about the voice he had heard outside the room that night. His grandfather confirmed without hesitation that it had not been him, that he had been downstairs the entire night, that neither he nor Fumiko had come near that hallway. Kenji did not ask any more questions after that. In time, Taro died. There were circumstances that meant Kenji could not attend the funeral. He understood why without needing it explained. Fumiko called him some time after, and told him something he filed under the category of things he preferred not to think about. One of the 4 Jizo statues at the shrine had been found broken. The direction it faced corresponded to the compass point that aligned with the road leading back toward the city, back toward where Kenji lived. He tries still to believe it was all superstition. He is mostly successful. He lives an ordinary life in a city apartment, and he does not visit the village, and he does not think about that night if he can help it. But sometimes, in the particular quiet of late evenings, when the traffic has thinned and the building is settling into its nighttime sounds, he hears it, just barely, just at the edge of audibility from somewhere he cannot locate. Popopo. And he does not go to the window. There is a particular kind of beauty that belongs only to the Northern California coast in winter, a beauty that doesn't comfort you, that doesn't invite you in. It is the beauty of something indifferent, of something older than language. The cliffs there don't gradually slope into the sea the way they do in gentler places. They simply end. One moment there is solid ground beneath your feet, and the next moment there is nothing, just 400 feet of gray air, and below that the Pacific Ocean doing what it has done for 10,000 years, slamming itself again and again against the rock as if it is trying to break something loose. The town where Elena grew up was called Harrow's Point, a name that suited it, sharp and slightly ominous, the kind of name a place earns through its geography rather than through any decision made by the people who live there. It had a population of about 2,000, give or take whoever had left for the winter, and it sat perched on a promontory of crumbling sandstone that geologists had been warning about for decades. Every few years, another section of the cliff face would carve away and plunge into the surf below, and the town would move its fences back another 3 feet, and life would continue. The residents of Harrow's Point had a complicated relationship with those cliffs. Children were warned away from the edges, dogs were kept on leashes near the coastal path, and yet everyone in town had a story, their own story, or a borrowed one, of standing at the edge at some point in their life and feeling that pull. Not a suicidal pull necessarily, just the strange gravitational tug that high places seem to exert on human beings, that whisper from the void that says, you could just step forward and find out what happens next. Most people step back from that feeling. Most people laugh it off and go home and make dinner and never mention it to anyone. Elena Vasquez had grown up here, the second daughter of a Portuguese fishing family that had been in Harrow's Point for 3 generations. Her father, a broad, weathered man named Domingo, repaired boat engines and rarely spoke. Her mother, Celia, grew dahlias in a small yard that faced away from the ocean, as if she had made a personal decision not to look at it. Elena's sister, Rosa, had left for college at 18 and never really come back. Not because she disliked the family, but because she had figured out early that some places ask too much of the people who love them. Elena had not figured that out. Or perhaps she had figured it out and decided, in the way that young people sometimes do, that she was different, that she could take what the place offered and not pay the toll. She was 23 years old when she met a man named Daniel at a bar in the next town over. He was from Sacramento, passing through on a road trip. and he had that easy, sunlit quality of someone who had grown up somewhere flat and warm and uncomplicated. He stayed 3 weeks longer than he planned. By the time he left, Eleanor was carrying his child, though she didn't know it yet. They'll tell you now. Doctors, researchers, anyone who works in maternal mental health. That postpartum depression is a medical condition. That it is physiological. That it is the result of a hormonal crash so severe and so sudden that the brain quite literally does not know what has happened to it. They'll tell you that it affects somewhere between 10 and 15% of new mothers, and that those numbers are almost certainly undercounted because many women don't report it, because of shame, or because they don't recognize it as an illness rather than a personal failing. What they have a harder time conveying is what it actually feels like from the inside. Elena would later describe it. Years later, in the context of therapy she was too frightened to fully commit to, as living underwater. Not drowning, just submerged. The world above the surface was still visible but distorted, its sounds arriving muffled and delayed, its urgencies seeming somehow abstract and unconvincing. People would speak to her, and she would watch their mouths move and understand, intellectually, that they were communicating something, but the emotional content of the communication, the warmth, the concern, the love, would not penetrate. It would just ripple across the surface and dissipate. Thomas was born in March of 1987, 6 pounds, 4 ounces, with his father's dark eyes and a shock of black hair that the nurse said would likely fall out and grow back lighter. Daniel had come back for the birth, had driven through the night when Elena called him, and he stayed for 3 weeks, sleeping on the couch, learning to change diapers, cooking soups that sat uneaten on the counter. He was trying. Elena could see that he was trying. But the distance between trying and reaching her felt, in those weeks, like the distance between continents. When Daniel left the second time, there was a job, a lease, obligations that could not be stretched any further. Eleanor's mother came to help. Celia was a practical woman, not given to sentiment. She did laundry. She held Thomas while Eleanor slept. But she didn't ask how Eleanor was feeling, not because she didn't care, but because in Celia's world you pushed through. You were grateful for what you had. You didn't name the dark thing in the corner of the room because naming it made it real. The dark thing in the corner of Elena's room was becoming very real. It started with the voices, and voices is the wrong word, actually, which is part of why Elena didn't seek help sooner. They weren't voices the way a person is a voice, with a distinct character and personality and specific things to say. They were more like whispers, shapeless, directional sounds that seemed to come from just outside her field of vision. When she was nursing at 3 in the morning, she would hear them from the corner of the nursery, near the window, a low sibilation that she told herself was the wind through the old frame, but that felt, in the unguarded hours before dawn, like something that had a source, something that was very close. Thomas cried. This is what babies do. They cry because they are hungry or cold or gassy or frightened, or for reasons that are entirely opaque to the adults tasked with interpreting the sound. But Elena had begun to experience Thomas's crying not as a need to be met, but as an accusation, as if the child, who was 6 weeks old, who was incapable of moral judgment, was nonetheless judging her. Every cry said, "You are insufficient. You are wrong. You were wrong to do this. You were wrong to become this. She didn't tell anyone. This is the part that is hardest to communicate to people who haven't been through it. The silence is not stubbornness. It is not pride. It is the product of a mind that has turned against itself so thoroughly that it can no longer accurately assess its own state. Eleanor did not call her sister. She did not call Daniel. She did not call her doctor or the crisis line on the refrigerator magnet her prenatal nurse had given her. She sat in the house at the edge of the cliffs, and the fog came in off the ocean every morning and erased the world down to a radius of about 30 feet, and she existed inside that radius like something sealed in a jar. Inside. The day it happened was a Tuesday in September, 6 months after Thomas was born. Elena's mother had stopped coming daily. Things were better, she thought. Eleanor seemed steadier. And the woman from 3 houses down, who sometimes checked in, was away visiting her own children in Portland. It was one of those days when the fog was so dense and so low that it felt less like weather and more like a decision the world had made, a choice to reduce everything to grey. Thomas had been crying since 5 in the morning, not continuously. There were intervals, merciful silences of 20 or 30 minutes during which Elena would finally begin to drift towards sleep, only to be snapped back by the next wave. By noon she had not slept in 31 hours. By 2 in the afternoon she was operating in a register that is difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced that specific variety of sleep-deprived derangement, a state in which the ordinary boundaries between thought and perception begin to dissolve, in which the world takes on a quality of unreality so profound that your own hands look like they belong to someone else. She picked Thomas up from his crib at 2:14 in the afternoon. She would later be able to reconstruct the timeline with terrible precision from small details, the soap opera on television she had not been watching, the position of the clock when she walked past it in the hallway. She held him against her chest, and she walked out the front door. She told herself she was going for a walk. She told herself the fresh air would help. She told herself this was a reasonable, normal thing that mothers did. Took their crying infants outside, walked until the baby calmed, turned around, and came home. The coastal path was empty. The fog had seen to that. Eleanor walked along it for what she estimated was 10 or 15 minutes, though she could not be certain, because time had become a flexible and untrustworthy thing. Thomas had stopped crying. The sound of the ocean grew louder as she approached the cliff's edge, that constant grinding percussion of water against stone. She stood at the edge for a long time. What was in her mind in those minutes? What reasoning or unreasoning led from standing there to what she did next is something she would spend the rest of her life trying to excavate, and never successfully. The mind, in its most broken states, does not leave clear records. What she would say, later, is that she had not felt like herself, that she had felt like she was watching herself from some distance, from somewhere above and to the left, like a camera angle in a film. That the Eleanor on the cliff was a different Elena, one who existed outside the normal rules of cause and consequence, outside the normal gravity of what things mean and what they cost. She let go. And the fog took him, and the sound of the ocean covered everything. The lie Elena told was not sophisticated. It did not have to be. A small town's capacity to comprehend the incomprehensible, a mother doing what Elena had done, was, in 1987, in a community that still thought of postpartum depression as something that happened to weaker women elsewhere, essentially zero. The story she gave the police was simple. She had taken Thomas to the small park 2 blocks from the house. She had set him down in his carrier for a moment to tie her shoe. When she looked up, a man, a stranger, she didn't get a good look at him, was walking away quickly with Thomas in his arms. She screamed. She ran. He was gone. The police searched. Of course they searched. The community organized. Flyers went up. The local paper ran the story on the front page for 3 consecutive weeks. A hotline received 412 calls, not one of them useful. A drifter who had been seen near town the week before was brought in for questioning and released. The case file grew thick with leads that went nowhere, and then thinner as the leads dried up, and then it sat on a shelf and gathered the particular kind of dust that cold cases gather, the dust of exhaustion, of diminishing hope, of the terrible administrative acknowledgement that some things cannot be resolved. Elena attended the vigils. She held candles. She cried in ways that looked to the people around her exactly like the crying of a grieving mother, because that is also what it was. A grieving mother who was grieving something she had done herself, which is a grief so complicated and so poisonous that it has no name in the ordinary emotional vocabulary. She accepted casseroles. She gave interviews. She wore the face of devastation. And the face of devastation was not a mask. 2 years after Thomas disappeared, Eleanor left Harrow's Point. She moved south to a mid-sized city and got a job doing data entry for an insurance company, and rented a small apartment with a courtyard, and began, very slowly and unevenly, to construct the scaffolding of a new life. She met Marcus at a work conference when she was 28. He was an actuary, a man whose professional life was built around the calculation of risk, around the precise mathematical modeling of how and when and under what circumstances terrible things happen to people. She would think about this later, with the particular dark irony that her situation warranted. She married him in a civil ceremony in 1993. She did not tell him about Thomas. She had never told anyone about Thomas, not the truth of it, not the real shape of what had happened on that cliff. It lived in her the way certain things live in people, not as a memory you access, but as a weather system you inhabit, present in every room, changing the atmospheric pressure of every moment. Leo was born in October of 1994. The pregnancy had been carefully managed. Elena had been honest with her obstetrician about her history of depression, if not about its causes, and there was a protocol in place. Medications monitored, check-ins scheduled, a therapist on standby. The postpartum period was watched over with the vigilance of people who understood what was at stake. It was nothing like the first time. Elena was 31, settled, supported. Marcus was present in a way that Daniel had not been able to be. The apartment they had moved into had good light, south-facing windows, a garden below. Elena held Leo in the first hours after his birth and felt something she had not felt with Thomas, an opening, a warmth, something she recognized as love. And yet, from the beginning, Leo was strange, not difficult. He was, by any measure, an easy baby. He slept well. He fed well. He hit his developmental markers ahead of schedule, his first words arriving at 9 months, clear and precise. It was not anything he did that unsettled Elena. It was the way he looked at her. Children look at their mothers with a specific quality of attention that is among the most purely human things in existence, a focused, searching gaze that is calibrating the relationship, learning the face, building the template for trust. Leo looked at Elena with that attention, but underneath it, or around the edges of it, was something else. A quality of recognition that did not match his age, an intensity that sat oddly in the face of an infant, and then a toddler, and then a small child who was approaching 4 years old, and had begun to speak in full sentences with a vocabulary that made the pediatrician raise his eyebrows. Eleanor told herself she was projecting. She told herself she was doing what guilty people do, reading accusation into neutral things, finding patterns where there were none, allowing the paranoia that had been her constant companion for 7 years to color her perception of an innocent child. She told her therapist, not the truth, never the truth, but the anxiety around it, that she sometimes felt Leo looked at her like he knew something. Her therapist nodded and said this was common, that the guilt around her first son's disappearance was naturally going to manifest in her relationship with her second child. Elena nodded and agreed and went home and lay awake and stared at the ceiling. In the summer of 1998, Elena's father died. Domingo Vasquez, 71 years old, his heart giving out quietly in the night, the way the hearts of stoic men sometimes do. Not dramatically, not in crisis, just stopping, like a clock that has run down. Eleanor flew back to Harrow's Point with Marcus and Leo, who was 3 years and 9 months old and very serious about everything. The town had not changed in the way that people sometimes say towns haven't changed, meaning the bones of it were the same, the harbor, the main street, the church with the iron weather vane, the particular smell of salt and engine oil, and something floral that Elena had never been able to identify. But it had aged. The houses looked smaller, the streets looked narrower. The cliff path visible from her parents' house was now fenced differently, the fence newer, 3 feet further back than it had been. She avoided the coast for the 3 days of the funeral proceedings. She drove the long way to the church. She took Leo to the small inland park. She sat with her mother in the kitchen and sorted through her father's things and talked about everything except what she was most aware of. The presence of the ocean at the edge of every conversation, the gravitational pull of that particular piece of land at the edge of the cliff. On the 4th night, after Marcus had fallen asleep and Leo was down, Elena found herself sitting in her rental car in the dark. She did not remember deciding to drive. She did not remember putting on her shoes. She found herself on the coastal road with the headlights illuminating the pale strip of asphalt ahead and the darkness absolute on either side. And she told herself she was just driving, just clearing her head, just needing air. She pulled over at the spot without planning to. The car simply stopped, the way cars stop when you take your foot off the gas and let the road decide. She did not get out immediately. She sat in the car for what might have been 5 minutes or 20, the engine ticking as it cooled, the sound of the ocean audible even through the closed windows, that ancient, indifferent percussion, that sound that had been here before anyone was alive to hear it and would continue long after. She became aware that Leo was awake. She turned to find him sitting upright in his car seat in the darkness of the back seat, his eyes open, watching her. "Where are we?" he asked. "Near Grandma's house," Elena said. "Near the water," Leo said. It was not a question. "Yes," Elena said, "near the water." Leo looked at her for a moment, then said, "Can I come?" Elena should have said no. She knows this. She has said this to herself, about this moment, thousands of times in the years since. She should have said no. She should have turned the key. She should have driven back to her sleeping husband and her father's borrowed house and locked the door against the ocean and the night and the pull of the place. But she was operating inside a gravity she did not fully understand, and she said yes, and she unbuckled Leo's car seat, and she took his hand, and they walked together to the edge. The wind was the same. That was the first thing she registered. The wind off the ocean at the cliff's edge was exactly the same as it had been 11 years earlier, on the Tuesday afternoon with the fog, the same temperature, the same character, the way certain weathers are so particular to a place that they are essentially that place's signature. The grass around their feet was wet with coastal dew. The rocks below were invisible in the darkness, but Elena knew exactly where they were. Leo gripped her hand. His small fingers were stronger than she expected. She looked down at him, and he was not looking at the ocean. He was looking up at her. In the darkness, his eyes caught the ambient light from somewhere, the moon behind clouds, the distant lights of the harbor, and they were very bright and very steady. She felt in that moment the vertigo she had expected, the familiar dissolving sensation of standing at a high edge, of looking down into darkness. But this vertigo was different from the old one. It was not the vertigo of emptiness. It was the vertigo of recognition, of something enormous becoming suddenly, unavoidably visible. Leo tightened his grip on her hand, and he said, "Don't push me again, Mama." His voice was perfectly level, calm the way deep water is calm. Not because nothing is happening beneath the surface, but because what is happening beneath the surface is too large to disturb it. He said the words the way a child states an observed fact. "It is raining. The grass is wet. Don't push me again." Eleanor's body stopped functioning in any normal way. Her breathing stopped. The sound of the ocean stopped, or seemed to stop, seemed to pull back, as if the world were drawing a breath. She looked down at Leo, and she saw. She would spend the rest of her life trying to describe this, never quite finding the language. She saw, for one moment, a double exposure. Leo's face, and behind it, or beneath it, like a watermark on paper, the face of Thomas at 6 months old, the face she had carried for 11 years, like a stone in her chest. Then Leo released her hand, turned around, and walked back toward the car. She watched him go. A 4-year-old in dark clothes walking away from the cliff edge, perfectly steady, unafraid, the wet grass whispering around his small feet. He opened the back door of the car. She had not locked it, climbed in, and pulled it shut behind him. Elena stood at the edge of the cliff for a very long time. She did not fall. She did not step forward. She stood there in the wind that was 11 years old and also 10,000 years old, and she felt something move through her that was not quite grief and not quite relief and not quite horror, something for which she was beginning to understand there would never be a sufficient word. She drove back to her parents' house. She put Leo to bed. She lay down beside Marcus and stared at the ceiling until the grey, pre-dawn light began to come in through the curtains, and then she got up and drove herself to the police station and asked to speak to someone about an old case. The confession she gave that morning was not legally admissible. She had no lawyer. The statute of limitations on what had happened 11 years before was a complicated question. The detective who took her statement was a young man who had been in high school when Thomas died, who had no memory of the case, who had to call 2 people before he found someone who knew where the file was. The legal consequences were ambiguous and slow-moving, and ultimately less final than Elena had perhaps imagined or hoped they would be. The law, it turned out, was not built to process a case like hers with any kind of cleanness. What happened to Eleanor after? The years of therapy, the marriage that survived it and the marriage that didn't, the relationship with Leo that became the most complicated and the most essential thing in her life, is a story that deserves more space than remains here. What is worth saying is this. Leo never mentioned the cliff again. Not once, not ever, through all of his childhood and adolescence and into adulthood. He grew into a quiet, thoughtful man who worked in conservation, who spent his professional life on the edges of things, coastlines, forest margins, the boundaries between what is protected and what is not. He and Elena spoke on the phone every Sunday morning. They did not discuss Harrow's Point. They did not discuss the night at the cliff. Eleanor sometimes thought, looking at him across a table at Thanksgiving, that she could see the question she would never ask living in him too, that it was the shape of the space between them. The case file on the disappearance of Thomas Vasquez was updated in 1998 with a supplementary report and then sealed. The coastal path at Harrow's Point was permanently closed in 2004 when a storm took another 40 feet of cliff face into the sea. The fence was moved back. New signs were posted. The ocean continued its work, patient and indifferent, wearing the rock away at whatever pace it chose. Some geographies hold what happens in them, whether it is the stone itself or the air above it, or simply the human memory that returns to the same places and reactivates the same recordings. The result is the same. Some ground does not let go of what it has witnessed. You can build a fence at the edge, you can put up signs, you can move away and stay away for 11 years and come back for a funeral, telling yourself you are a different person now, that enough time has passed, that the debt has been eroded by the ordinary accumulation of days. You can stand at the edge in the dark and feel the weight of your child's hand in yours, and hear him say the thing that means everything, and still not fully understand what is being asked of you. But then the child turns around and walks back to the car, and you are left standing at the edge of the world, which is also the beginning of the water, and you understand, maybe for the first time, in the only way that certain truths can be understood through the body rather than the mind, that some secrets do not stay buried. They just find another way home. In a quiet, upscale neighborhood, there was an elderly couple, we'll call them the Millers, who lived in a house that was perfectly maintained, except for one very specific room. Now, the Millers were at a point in their lives where the daily chores were becoming a bit too much to handle, so they decided to hire a full-time maid to help out around the house. They eventually hired a woman named Elena. Elena was hard-working and dutiful, but from the very first day she stepped into the Miller home, she felt a profound sense of unease. You see, Mrs. Miller had a lifelong passion. She was a collector of antique porcelain dolls, and she didn't just have a few on a shelf. She had an entire room dedicated to them. There were hundreds of these dolls, ranging from tiny Victorian figures to life-sized creations that looked so realistic it was almost distressing to look at them. The Millers made it very clear that Elena's primary responsibility, besides the general cleaning, was the care and maintenance of this collection. Every single day, Eleanor had to enter that room and meticulously dust every porcelain cheek, every silk dress, and every glass eye. And for Eleanor, this was a nightmare. She absolutely loathed the dolls. To her, they weren't just toys. They were like a room full of silent, unblinking spectators that followed her every move. She felt like their glass eyes were constantly boring into the back of her head, watching her, judging her, and it made her skin crawl. One afternoon, while Elena was begrudgingly working her way through a row of dolls on a high shelf, a peculiar one caught her eye. It was a vintage talking doll from the 1950s with a small pull cord on its back. Now, Eleanor usually avoided touching the dolls more than necessary, but for some reason her curiosity got the better of her. She reached out, took the doll off the shelf, and gave the cord a firm tug. A mechanical, slightly distorted voice crackled out of the doll's chest. "Hello?" Elena froze. The voice was tiny and tinny, but in the dead silence of that room, it sounded incredibly loud. She felt a chill go down her spine, but she couldn't stop herself. She pulled the cord again. This time, the doll said, "I love my mama." Elena's heart dropped into her stomach. There was something about the way the doll said "mama" that felt heavy and wrong. It didn't sound like a joyful child. It sounded like a recording from a different era that shouldn't be playing anymore. She practically shoved the doll back onto the shelf and sprinted out of the room to finish the rest of her chores, her mind racing with a sense of total, absolute dread. A few weeks passed, and Eleanor had settled into a routine, though she still hated that doll room with every fiber of her being. One morning, she was dusting near a particularly fragile Victorian doll when her elbow accidentally swept it off the pedestal. The sound of the porcelain shattering against the hardwood floor was like a gunshot. Mrs. Miller, who was in the next room, came rushing in. When she saw her cherished doll in pieces on the floor, she was absolutely devastated. She fell to her knees, sobbing over the wreckage as if she had lost a family member. Elena apologized profusely, swearing it was a total accident and promising to be more cautious, but the damage was done. Mr. Miller pulled Elena aside later that day and gave her a very firm, very cold warning. He told her that his wife's collection was her life's work, and if Elena couldn't exercise extreme care around the dolls, she would be fired immediately. Elena nodded and agreed, but inside she was boiling with a dark, vicious frustration. The next day, the Millers had to leave the house for a few hours to attend a funeral. Elena was alone in the house, and her irritation had reached a breaking point. She was tired of being treated like a servant, tired of the creepy dolls, and tired of being scolded. She walked into the kitchen, opened the Miller's expensive box of imported chocolates, and began eating them, one after another, just out of spite. As she sat there, a cruel, barbaric thought crossed her mind. She walked back to the doll room, but she didn't bring her duster. She stood in the center of the room, surrounded by those hundreds of staring eyes, and she just snapped. She grabbed a heavy bookend from a nearby desk and began smashing the dolls. One by one, she shattered their faces, ripped their silk dresses, and crushed their delicate hands. She felt a dark, stomach-churning pleasure in the destruction. It was absolute chaos. She was finally taking her revenge on the silent audience that had tormented her for months. But her frenzy was suddenly interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. The Millers had returned early. Mrs. Miller walked into the room and let out a scream that would have unsettled the bravest of souls. When she saw the carnage, her life's work reduced to porcelain shards and torn fabric, she collapsed into her husband's arms. Mr. Miller looked at Elena with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. He didn't even ask for an explanation. He just pointed at the door and told her to get out and never come back. Elena stormed out of the house, her blood boiling. She didn't feel guilty. She felt wronged. She felt like she was the victim. And as she sat in her small, dark apartment that night, her anger curdled into a sinister, premeditated plan. Late that night, under the cover of a total pitch-black darkness, Elena snuck back to the Miller home. She still had her spare key. She crept through the house, her heart pounding against her ribs, and made her way to the kitchen where she grabbed a large, heavy kitchen knife. She tiptoed up the stairs to the master bedroom where the elderly couple was fast asleep. And in a series of horrific, vicious movements, she silenced them both. She wanted to make sure they could never look at her with that judgmental hatred again. The following morning, Eleanor did something truly sociopathic. She called the police herself, posing as a grief-stricken friend who had come by to check on the couple. When the investigators arrived, Elena put on a total act, weeping and wailing about the random robbery gone wrong. While the police were processing the crime scene in the bedroom, Elena felt a strange magnetic pull toward the doll room. She wanted to see the destruction one last time. She walked in, and the air felt freezing, as if she were standing inside a refrigerator. She looked around at the broken dolls, feeling a sense of triumph. She walked over to the shelf where the talking doll sat, the only one she hadn't smashed. She reached out and pulled the cord. The mechanical voice crackled out, "Why did you kill my mama?" Elena's heart stopped. She stood there, frozen, her brain unable to compute what she had just heard. "It's just a coincidence," she whispered to herself. "It's just a toy." She pulled the cord again, her hand shaking. "Why did you kill my mama?" Panic, pure and absolute, began to take over. She pulled the cord a third time, then a fourth, and every single time, that accusatory, tinny voice asked the same question. "Why did you kill my mama?" Eleanor turned and fled the house, sprinting into the night like a person possessed. The next morning, the police found Eleanor's body lying on a park bench not far from the Miller home. She was stone-cold dead, and her face was frozen in a mask of unbelievable terror. Clutched tightly in her hand was the talking doll. When the lead detective knelt down and pulled the doll's cord, he expected to hear a greeting or a nursery rhyme, but instead, the doll just repeated over and over again, "She killed my mama. She killed my mama." And just like that, Eleanor's chilling secret was out.